Today is the International Day of Pregnancy Loss and Infant Loss. It's a global day which recognises the women around the world who have lost children in childbirth, and it's something that has been a passionate issue of one MP, Senator Kristina Keneally. She lost her own child to stillbirth and has led a Senate inquiry. We've seen today one of the first recommendations of that inquiry is going to be enacted in a bipartisan show of support, and there has been really bipartisan support in dealing with this issue. And so we spoke to the Shadow Home Affairs Minister about this, but also about a number of the political issues in Parliament this week. Kristina Keneally, thank you for your time. So today's Pregnancy and Infant Loss Awareness Day. It's a huge day for many women who've experienced the loss of a child. And it's significant in Parliament as well. What actions are you taking today with the government that we're going to see come through?
Well, of course, this follows on, Annalise, from the Senate stillbirth inquiry, which was a bipartisan effort and supported on all sides of the Parliament. And the government has accepted all of the recommendations either in full or in principle from that report. What today will happen in the Senate is a motion moved by myself with the support of Senator Lambie, other Labor senators, the Greens and the government to recognise Pregnancy and Infant Loss Day, and particularly to recognise the 6 families every day in Australia who lose a baby to stillbirth.
One of the initiatives that does have bipartisan support is this Safer Baby Bundle. I think it's really interesting to see in the details of that one of the things that they're pushing for is autopsies and audits of stillborns. It's extraordinary to think that you'd have a stillborn and never find out what went wrong.
This came out of the Senate inquiry. The reality is most stillbirths in Australia are not investigated, and we don't do autopsies for every stillbirth, partly because they're the last thing that gets funded often in state health budgets, and some states don't fund them at all, and partly because doctors and midwives aren't trained to talk to parents at a time of profound and terrible grief about what would be the benefits of having an autopsy. So as a result, families are left without information on how to prevent a subsequent stillbirth, and stillbirth can happen multiple times to a family. And the health system as a whole, we as a country are left without information on how to prevent stillbirths, to feed those recommendations back into clinical practice. It is extraordinary to me that we are, as a nation, watching 6 babies a day die and yet not inquiring why and trying to figure out how we can use that information to prevent further tragedy.
And just for the family, their own closure, it would be so hard not to know what went wrong.
Well, for families, sometimes they're told by the doctor, and I understand this, that doctors don't want to put a family in trauma through any further trauma. So sometimes we had reports in the Senate inquiry of families saying the doctor told us, you probably won't learn anything. Well, it's possible you may not learn anything, but it's quite possible you'll learn a great deal. And at a minimum, we should be investigating the placenta of every stillborn baby. What's really pleasing coming out of the Senate inquiry is that we made a recommendation that the government should investigate putting stillbirth autopsies on the medical benefit scheme, and the government have accepted that and are indeed investigating that now.
It is nice to see bipartisan support on something so important. And then the other issue that you're calling for is paid parental leave for parents of stillborn children. Again, that's something I think a lot of people would be surprised doesn't already exist.
Yeah, this one is interesting because it does exist for the Commonwealth-funded, the government-funded scheme. Some companies do provide it. Some people, and I get this, they instinctively say, well, why do you need paid parental leave? There's no baby to care for. And I understand that, but I would ask people to consider that it's parental leave, it's not baby leave. And so that means it's for the parents. And parents of stillborn babies are parents. The mother has given birth. She needs to recover physically from that as she would if she'd had a live birth. And then they have parental responsibilities. They do have often to make decisions about autopsies and then to get the results of that and then any other genetic counselling and to go through their own exploration as to why this happened. They have to organise funerals and cremation and burial. They have to grieve. This is a singular, profound grief. It's an extraordinary grief. And if we see parents returning to the workforce too early, they're not productive and they're not healing. We heard terrible stories about, one woman in the Senate inquiry told us she had to return to work after 11 days. Another family told us how they essentially had to shut down their business because they were unable to cope at that time to keep it running, and they had to move and change their whole livelihood. These are real world impacts of the devastating loss that stillbirth inflicts on families.
Do you think there's anything the government can actually do in this space, or is this more up to the private sector?
Well, certainly the private sector could take its own initiative and companies could make those decisions, and many have, to be fair. But the Commonwealth, there are things, and the Senate inquiry recommended some things that the government can do in relation to national employment standards to ensure that parents of stillborn babies have equitable access to parental leave.
Now, if we turn to some of the other issues that are in Parliament this week, Labor's really seized on this mishap in the Senate last night, Cory Bernardi missing his vote. And so these amendments put forward by Rex Patrick to airport security ended up being quite an issue for the government. Why did Labor switch their vote, though? Is this just playing politics, that you wanted to embarrass the government?
No, and Labor had made clear that we were going to support Senator Patrick's amendment into a review into these powers. These are new powers given to police at airports, and while we support the federal police and we support keeping our country, our borders, and the Australian people and tourists safe at airports, we felt that new powers should have a review and thought it was a sensible proposition. Through the course of the debate, when the government did not oppose the review, when it became clear that the government was going to accept the review, it seemed appropriate to support the sunset as well that would come after the review. It would give the review meaning, if you will. That is, there's a review and then there's a sunset, and it would be then a decision by the government of the day to decide whether or not to extend those powers. It's a perfectly normal course of events for security legislation. I want to make the point, Annalise, that the Senate functioned as it should. There was a debate and there was a consideration of that debate and the results. I also want to make the point the government's bill passed. They got their new powers, police powers at airports bill passed last night through the Senate. It was just simply amended to include a review and a sunset, which is not unusual.
What are your concerns, though? Because those powers include asking people in airports for IDs. That's by police, being able to ask people to leave and not come back for 24 hours. That all seems awfully sensible in highly sensitive security situations.
And to be fair, we support these powers, and we have. But when you have new powers, and particularly when you're giving additional powers to police, there have been concerns raised in the past about ensuring that they are functioning as they should. And through the course of this legislation, there were concerns raised about whether or not the powers were being used appropriately. This simply gives the Parliament the ability to ensure that that's happening. It's quite possible a review will happen and we'll see that these powers are working exceptionally well, and then they'll be continued by a decision of the Parliament.
One of the real headaches for the government is getting anything through the Senate at the moment. Pauline Hanson's making their life difficult, saying that she's not going to support anything without reform for dairy farmers. Do you support what Pauline Hanson's calling for?
Well, going into the election, Labor made clear that we were going to have a full-scale review of the price on milk. It's an interesting tactic that Pauline Hanson has taken to go on strike, although I would note she voted last night in the Senate with the government, the vote that they lost on the sunset powers. So the strike seems to be as it suits her. I think I just reflect that the government's losing control of its agenda and it's losing control of the Senate. What did we see yesterday? We saw them accidentally mail their talking points out to the entire federal press gallery. We saw them have to admit in a completely embarrassing bungle, bureaucratic bungle, that they gave the wrong information, the wrong data, in the wrong numbers when it came to airport arrivals in our country.
They've said that that's really just playing semantics, that we're talking about the dates between, like...
Plain semantics, plain, first of all, good pun. But the reality is they were asked a very specific question and they gave the wrong number.
We're talking about like slightly different reporting periods though, aren't we? Like August 19 versus September 1st for that issue. Like,
the point is the government were asked a very specific question and they gave the wrong numbers, and they've now had to come back and correct themselves. And then they end the day by losing a vote in the Senate because they weren't on top of what was going on in the chamber. They're losing control of their narrative. It's incompetence writ large, and it's, I think it just goes to show this is a government that doesn't have an agenda. They don't have anything to say. They don't have a plan on the economy. They don't have a plan when it comes to stagnant wages or rising cost of living. And really, they're floundering around in the Senate.
They've taken aim at your call for the government to consider all options when it comes to especially women and children who are stuck in Syria, who might have been taken there by their partners, their husbands. Is that compromising Australia's national security when you put those options on the table?
The government themselves are the only people who can make a decision about what to do in relation to the women and the children who are currently in the Al-Hol internal displacement camp in Syria. They're the only people who have the capacity and the information from national security agencies.
So why should they, though? Because you've said it's a moral issue. Why should they?
Well, it is a moral issue, and the Prime Minister has reflected, as has Minister Peter Dutton, about the terrible situation these utterly innocent children are in. Some 40 children who are either Australian citizens or have a claim to Australian citizenship are in. They are in this camp in Syria. By all accounts, there are quite horrific conditions there. And they are innocent victims. We also know, I've been briefed by the Department of Home Affairs that some of the women there were taken against their will or taken there as children and are now adults. And they are victims too. And it is incumbent upon the government to consider if it is safe to remove those children and women. I'd also reflect that the United States President and the United States Secretary of State have been calling on their Western allies to deal with their citizens in Syria. The Independent National Security Legislation Monitor here in Australia has warned that leaving foreign fighters in the Middle East, in Syria in particular, is akin to leaving foreign fighters in Afghanistan in the 1970s. Those people went on to form Al-Qaeda. There is a risk, yes, to bringing people back to Australia, particularly those who have a determination, and I accept fully that there are some people, either those men who are imprisoned or some of the women in the camp, who do have a determination to harm Australia. But I think the Prime Minister and the Minister for Home Affairs need to be straight with the Australian people that while there is a risk to bringing people back, there is also a risk to leaving them there, and talk to the Australian people honestly about what those risks are to leaving people
There'd also be a risk to life of getting them out. If you're going to send Australian troops in there, why should we be following the United States lead when they've just abandoned the Kurds there for everything?
Well, except the United States has been bringing their citizens out. The United States has been dealing with their citizens. Other nations have been bringing their citizens out. And whilst I can't make a decision sitting here with you because I don't have the information the government does in relation to what the risks are, I would reflect that just a few weeks ago, a couple of the Australian grandparents of these children were able to visit the camp. It is only the government can speak to whether the risks are appropriate or manageable. They did in previous times manage to get some people out. So it is a question for the government to answer. Look, it is a terrible moral dilemma that the government faces. I'm not shying away from that, but it is one that we need to have a conversation about, both in terms of what do we do about those 40 Australian children or children who have a claim to Australian citizenship, who are the terrible innocent victims here, and what do we do to ensure that we have a safer world, and whether or not it is in creating a safer world by leaving foreign fighters there in Syria or dealing with them in our system where we have the ability to prosecute them, the ability to put them in jail, the ability to hold them in jail in a continuing detention order as long as they continue to pose a threat to
That's a huge investment from the government, though, to have to put those resources into managing people who most likely want to come and harm Australia.
There are already some 75 convictions that have occurred for terrorist offences, and there are some 55 people in jail here. I mean, this is...
And you want to up that number?
Well, what I want to do is ensure that we have a safer world. And I think the question, there is no free way to do that. There's no cost-free way to do that. And I think the questions that the government, all governments around the world, need to contemplate is how do we ensure we don't have what we saw coming out of Afghanistan in the 1970s, a resurgence of a group of Islamist extremists who would seek to do us harm.